Carlos Hathcock was the sniper who hunted hunters. Imagine being so deadly, so feared by the enemy, that they place a bounty on your head worth $30,000, more than most Americans earned in a year. Imagine crawling through enemy territory for 4 days without sleep, moving inches at a time, so slowly that enemy soldiers walk right past you without seeing you. Imagine looking through your rifle scope and seeing a glint of light in the jungle, and in that split second, deciding to fire. Your bullet travels through the enemy sniper's scope, down the length of his rifle, and enters his eye, killing him instantly. Because that's the only way that shot is possible, if he was aiming directly at you at the exact same moment. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is what actually happened to Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, the legendary Marine sniper known as White Feather, who wore a white feather in his hat to taunt the enemy. A man who had 93 confirmed kills, but estimated he actually killed between 300 and 400. A man who hunted generals, battled enemy snipers sent specifically to kill him, and pioneered the techniques that every military sniper uses today. By the end of this video, you'll discover why Carlos Hathcock is considered the greatest sniper in American military history, how a poor Arkansas boy became a ghost in the jungle, and why even today, decades after his death, his story is still whispered with reverence in sniper communities around the world. Stay with me because Carlos Hathcock's story will show you what it means to be the hunter who becomes the hunted. Part 1. Born to Hunt. Childhood in Arkansas. The story of Carlos Norman Hathcock II begins on May 20th, 1942, in Little Rock, Arkansas. The United States had just entered World War II. The nation was at war, and in a small house in Arkansas, a boy was born who would one day become one of America's deadliest warriors. Carlos's parents, Carlos Norman Hathcock I and Mae Thompson, were poor, very poor. Carlos Sr. worked whatever jobs he could find, but money was always tight. When Carlos was still a baby, his parents separated. For the first 12 years of his life, Carlos lived with his grandmother, Myrtle, in the small town of Winnie, Arkansas. Winnie was rural, isolated and surrounded by forests. There wasn't much to do, and there certainly wasn't any money for entertainment. But young Carlos found his joy in the woods. He would disappear into the forests for hours, exploring, adventuring, and most importantly, hunting. Carlos's father had brought back a Mauser rifle from World War II. It was a war relic, no longer functional, but Carlos loved it. At age 3, his father gave him that rifle, and Carlos would carry it into the woods with his dog, pretending to be a soldier hunting Japanese troops in the Pacific. It was just a game, a child's imagination running wild, but it was also training. By the time Carlos was 10 years old, he had a real rifle, a J.C. Higgins .22 caliber single shot, and he became an exceptional hunter. Hunting wasn't a sport for Carlos. It was survival. His family was desperately poor, and the meat he brought home often made the difference between eating and going hungry. Carlos hunted squirrels, rabbits, deer, anything that could be eaten, and he almost never missed. He developed an uncanny ability to judge distances, to compensate for wind, to predict where an animal would move. He learned patience, learning to sit motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. He learned to move silently through the woods, leaving no trace. He learned to think like his prey. These skills, learned out of necessity in the forests of Arkansas, would one day make him the most feared sniper in Vietnam. But Carlos dreamed of something more than hunting animals. From a very young age, he dreamed of being a United States Marine. He would tell anyone who would listen, "I'm going to be a Marine someday." And on May 20th, 1959, his 17th birthday, Carlos Hathcock enlisted in the United States Marine Corps with his mother's written permission. Part 2. Becoming a Marksman. Early military career. Boot camp at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego was brutal, as it was designed to be. The drill instructors broke down recruits and rebuilt them as Marines. But for Carlos Hathcock, one part of boot camp stood out: marksmanship qualification. When Carlos stepped onto the rifle range, he felt at home. This was what he had been doing his entire life. He qualified at the expert level, the highest marksmanship rating in the Marine Corps. His instructors noticed immediately. This kid from Arkansas could shoot. After boot camp, Carlos was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina. In 1962, he set a record on the A marksmanship range by shooting 248 out of a possible 250 points. That record stood until the course was retired years later. In November 1962, Carlos married Josephine Bryan Winstead in North Carolina. They would eventually have one son, Carlos Norman Hathcock III, who would also join the Marine Corps, continuing the family tradition. But Carlos's true calling was still ahead of him. In 1965, he achieved something remarkable. He won the Wimbledon Cup, the most prestigious long-range shooting championship in the United States. The Wimbledon Cup is awarded at the National Rifle and Pistol matches held at Camp Perry, Ohio, and winning it is considered the pinnacle achievement for American marksmen. Competitors shoot at targets 1,000 yards away, and only the very best shooters in the country even qualify to compete. Carlos Hathcock, a 23-year-old Marine corporal from Arkansas, won it. He had made a name for himself, and the Marine Corps took notice. When the Vietnam War escalated and the need for trained snipers became critical, Carlos Hathcock was one of the first Marines selected. In 1966, Carlos deployed to Vietnam. His official assignment was as a military policeman, but that wouldn't last long. Part 3. The White Feather. First tour in Vietnam. Carlos Hathcock arrived in South Vietnam in 1966 and was initially assigned to the military police. But almost immediately, he volunteered for combat duty. He didn't want to sit on a base checking IDs. He wanted to fight. His request was noticed by Captain Edward James Land, who was pioneering the use of snipers in the Marine Corps. Captain Land had established the first organized Marine sniper training program and was actively recruiting the best marksmen he could find. When he learned that the 1965 Wimbledon Cup winner was serving as a military policeman in Vietnam, he immediately had Carlos transferred to the 1st Marine Division Sniper Platoon. Carlos was assigned to Hill 55, a firebase located southwest of Da Nang. Hill 55 was surrounded by hostile territory. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army controlled the villages and jungles in every direction. Snipers operating from Hill 55 went out on missions deep into enemy territory, alone or in pairs, hunting high-value targets. And Carlos Hathcock excelled. He was equipped with a Winchester Model 70 rifle, chambered in .30-06, topped with an untold 10x scope. It was a simple, rugged setup, but in Carlos's hands, it was devastatingly effective. From the very beginning, Carlos did something that made him legendary. He wore a white feather in the band of his bush hat. It was a taunt, a challenge to the enemy. Here I am. Come find me if you can. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army called him Dukik Long Kran, White Feather Sniper, and they feared him. Carlos's first confirmed kill came early in his deployment, then another, then another. He operated with calm, methodical precision. He would study enemy movement patterns, identify high-value targets like officers and radio operators, and take them out with single, perfectly placed shots. But what made Carlos truly dangerous wasn't just his marksmanship, it was his fieldcraft. He could disappear into the jungle. His commanding officer, Captain Land, once said, "Carlos became part of the environment. He totally integrated himself. He had the patience, drive, and courage to do the job." Carlos would spend days in the field, moving slowly, setting up ambushes, waiting for the perfect shot. He lived on minimal food and water. He endured heat, mosquitoes, leeches, and the constant threat of discovery. But he never wavered. By the end of his first tour, Carlos had 93 confirmed kills, but he estimated his actual total was between 300 and 400.
Part 4. The General. 4 days and 3 nights. One of Carlos Hathcock's most famous missions came near the end of his first tour in Vietnam. A high-ranking North Vietnamese Army general was operating in the region, coordinating attacks against American forces. Intelligence located his encampment, heavily guarded and deep in enemy territory. The mission was considered nearly impossible. The area was patrolled constantly. Any conventional assault would result in massive casualties. But if someone could sneak close enough to the general's position and take him out with a single shot, it could disrupt enemy operations for weeks. Carlos Hathcock volunteered. The details of the mission were so classified that Carlos wasn't even told what it was until after he accepted. When he learned the target and the location, he understood why. This was a suicide mission. The odds of getting in, taking the shot, and getting out alive were almost zero. But Carlos had a plan. He wouldn't approach the encampment directly. He would crawl, slowly, patiently, moving only inches at a time. Carlos was transported by helicopter to a field about 1,500 yards from the target. That's nearly a mile, and he crawled the entire distance. For 4 days and 3 nights, Carlos inched forward on his stomach. He moved so slowly that grass and vegetation grew around him, camouflaging him naturally. He covered himself with mud and leaves. He became part of the earth. At times, North Vietnamese patrols walked within feet of him. Carlos lay completely still, barely breathing, as enemy soldiers passed so close he could have reached out and touched them. Once he felt something crawling on his leg, a bamboo viper, one of the deadliest snakes in Vietnam. Carlos didn't move. If he flinched, if he gave away his position, he was dead. The snake eventually crawled away. For 4 days, Carlos didn't sleep. He didn't stand. He barely drank water. The heat was unbearable. Insects crawled all over him. His muscles screamed in agony. But he kept crawling. Finally, on the 4th day, Carlos reached a position within 700 yards of the general's quarters. He set up his rifle, chambered around, and waited. The general emerged onto a porch, yawned, and stretched. An aide stepped in front of him. Carlos waited. The aide moved. Carlos fired. The bullet struck the general in the chest, killing him instantly. Chaos erupted in the encampment. Soldiers ran in every direction, searching for the snapper. Carlos waited until they ran toward the tree line for cover. Then he began crawling back the way he had come. For 3 more days, Carlos crawled through enemy territory as hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers searched for him. They never saw him, not once. When Carlos finally reached the extraction point and was flown back to Hill 55, he had completed one of the most audacious sniper missions in military history. This was the only mission during which Carlos removed the white feather from his hat. He knew the odds were so slim that he didn't want anyone else to attempt it if he died. So he went alone, carrying the burden himself. Part 5. The Cobra. The Sniper Duel. Carlos Hathcock's deadliest enemy wasn't a general or a platoon. It was another sniper. A North Vietnamese sniper known only as the Cobra. The Cobra was an elite marksman, sent specifically to kill Carlos Hathcock. The North Vietnamese had placed a bounty on the white feather's head, $30,000, an astronomical sum. Most American snipers had bounties of $1,000 to $2,000, but the white feather was worth $30,000. The Cobra began hunting Marines around Hill 55, picking them off one by one. He was trying to draw Carlos out, and it worked. One day, the Cobra killed a Marine gunnery sergeant right outside Carlos's living quarters. Carlos watched his friend die, bleeding out in the dirt. He later said, "I took a vow right there and then. I was going to get him some way or another." Carlos's commanding officer offered to transfer him away from Hill 55 to keep him safe. He refused. "This is personal," he said. Carlos and his spotter, John Roland Burke, began tracking the Cobra. For days they moved through the jungle searching for any sign of the enemy sniper. They knew the Cobra was out there hunting them just as they hunted him. Then one day, while moving through dense vegetation, Carlos caught a glint of light. Just a flash, lasting a fraction of a second. Sunlight reflecting off glass. In that instant, Carlos made a decision. He fired. His bullet struck the glint and disappeared into the jungle. Carlos and Burke waited, weapons ready. Silence. They moved carefully forward and found the cobra's body. Carlos's bullet had entered the enemy sniper's scope, traveled the entire length of the scope tube, and entered the cobra's eye, killing him instantly. This shot is almost impossible. It can only happen if both snipers are aiming directly at each other at the exact same moment. If the cobra's scope had been pointed even slightly away, the bullet would have deflected. But it didn't. The bullet went straight through. Carlos later said, "If I hadn't got him just then, he would have gotten me." The cobra's death was confirmed when Marines recovered the body and the rifle. The scope was hollowed out by Carlos's bullet. This shot has been recreated in countless movies and video games, but it only happened once in real life, and Carlos Hathcock was the man who made it. Part 6. The Apache. The most personal kill. There was one enemy Carlos rarely spoke about, a Viet Cong guerrilla fighter known as the Apache. The Apache wasn't just a soldier, she was a torturer. She would capture Marines, bring them close to American positions, and torture them within earshot of their comrades. The screams could be heard on the base. Marines would listen in horror as their friends were skinned alive, dismembered, and left to die slowly. One Marine was tortured all night and into the next day. When the Apache finally released him, he crawled to the barbed wire perimeter and died in front of his fellow Marines. Carlos described the Apache as pure evil, and hunting her became the most personal mission of his career. For weeks, Carlos and a spotter searched for the Apache. They knew she operated in the area, but she was elusive, moving constantly, never staying in one place. Then one day, while on a routine patrol, Carlos saw a group of Viet Cong moving through the jungle, and among them was a woman, the Apache. Carlos waited. He watched, and when the group stopped to rest, the Apache moved away from the others to relieve herself. That's when Carlos took the shot. He later said it was the best shot of his entire Marine Corps career, not because of the difficulty, but because of what it meant. The torture stopped. Marines stopped dying in agony. Carlos rarely talked about the Apache. When asked about her, his face would darken. It was very, very personal, he would say. And that's all he would say.
Part 7. The record-breaking shot. During his time at Hill 55, Carlos Hathcock pioneered a technique that would change sniper warfare forever. He mounted a scope onto a 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun. The 50 caliber M2 is a heavy machine gun designed for anti-vehicle and anti-aircraft use. It fires massive rounds capable of tearing through armor. No one had ever thought to use it as a sniper rifle. But Carlos saw its potential. With the right optics and a stable mount, the 50 caliber could engage targets at distances far beyond what a standard sniper rifle could reach. Navy Seabees helped Carlos design a custom mount for the weapon. Then, Carlos spent 3 days zeroing the rifle, learning how the massive rounds behaved at extreme distances. On the 4th day, Carlos watched through his scope as a North Vietnamese soldier walked into the exact spot where Carlos had zeroed the rifle, 2,500 yards away. That's nearly a mile and a half. Carlos fired. The massive 50 caliber round took several seconds to reach the target. Then the soldier fell, dead. Carlos Hathcock had just set the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in history, 2,460 yards. That record stood for 35 years until it was broken by a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan in 2002. Today, every military in the world uses 50 caliber sniper rifles. Carlos Hathcock invented the technique. Part 8. The end of the war. The mine and the fire. In 1967, Carlos Hathcock returned to the United States after completing his first tour in Vietnam. He had earned a reputation as the greatest sniper in the Marine Corps, but he couldn't stay away. He missed Vietnam. He missed the Marines. He missed the mission. In 1969, Carlos returned to Vietnam for a second tour, this time as a platoon commander, leading a team of snipers. He continued his work, training younger Marines, conducting missions, and racking up more confirmed kills. Then, on September 16, 1969, everything came to a brutal end. Carlos was riding in an Amtrak, an amphibious armored personnel carrier, traveling through enemy territory near the village of Quay Son. Suddenly, the vehicle struck a 500-pound anti-tank mine. The explosion was massive. The Amtrak erupted in flames. Fuel tanks ruptured, spilling burning gasoline over everything. Marines inside the vehicle were on fire, screaming, dying. Carlos, also on fire, could have run. He could have saved himself, but he didn't. Despite suffering severe burns over most of his body, Carlos pulled 7 Marines out of the burning wreckage. One by one, he dragged them to safety. His clothes melted into his skin. His face, arms, neck, and legs were covered in third-degree burns. The pain was unimaginable. By the time he pulled the last Marine out, Carlos collapsed. Medics rushed him to a field hospital, then evacuated him to a hospital in the United States. Carlos Hathcock's war was over. Part 9. After the war. Pain, legacy, and loss. Carlos spent months in the hospital recovering from his burns. The physical scars were terrible, but they healed. The emotional scars never did. For his actions in pulling 7 Marines from the burning Amtrak, Carlos was awarded the Purple Heart. But it would be nearly 30 years before he received the recognition he truly deserved. In 1996, Carlos was finally awarded the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest military decorations, for his heroism that day. After recovering, Carlos returned to active duty and helped establish the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico, Virginia. He designed the curriculum, trained instructors, and passed on his knowledge to a new generation of Marines. Elite units from around the world, including SEAL Team 6, sent their snipers to train under Carlos Hathcock. But Carlos's body was failing. The burns had caused permanent damage. He was in constant pain. And then in the mid-1970s, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that attacks the nervous system. By 1975, Carlos's health had deteriorated so badly that he could barely function. In 1979, he was medically discharged from the Marine Corps after 20 years of service. Carlos spent his final years confined to a wheelchair, his body ravaged by disease. But he never stopped being a Marine. He gave interviews, shared his stories, and inspired countless young marksmen. On February 22, 1999, Carlos Norman Hathcock II died from complications of multiple sclerosis. He was 56 years old. Part 10. The legend lives on. Carlos Hathcock's legacy is immeasurable. The Marine Corps Sniper School he helped establish is still training Marines today. The techniques he pioneered are still used by snipers around the world. The .50 caliber sniper rifles that every military uses were his invention. In 1986, a biography titled Marine Sniper, 93 Confirmed Kills by Charles Henderson was published. It became a bestseller and introduced Carlos's story to millions of people. The USMC Award for Most Outstanding Marksman is named the Gunnery Sergeant Carlos N. Hathcock II Award. Buildings, libraries, and shooting ranges bear his name. A variant of the M21 rifle was named the Springfield Armory M25 White Feather in his honor. But perhaps Carlos's greatest legacy is the respect he commanded from those who knew him. Fellow Marines described him as humble, professional, and deeply committed to his men. He never bragged about his kills. He never glorified war. He simply did his duty. Captain Land, Carlos's commanding officer, once said,
Carlos felt very strongly that he was saving Marine lives. That's why he did what he did. Conclusion: the meaning of Carlos Hathcock. So what can we learn from the life of Carlos Hathcock? First, that skill without discipline is useless. Carlos was a gifted marksman, but it was his patience, his fieldcraft, and his mental toughness that made him legendary. Second, that true heroism often comes at a great cost. Carlos saved 7 Marines from that burning Amtrak, but he paid for it with his health and ultimately his life. And third, that the best warriors are often the most humble. Carlos never sought fame. He never wanted to be called a hero. He just wanted to save lives and do his job. And finally, that legacy isn't about how many enemies you kill. It's about how many friends you save. Carlos Hathcock killed between 93 and 400 enemy soldiers, but he saved countless Marine lives by eliminating threats before they could strike. Carlos Hathcock, the poor boy from Arkansas who dreamed to be a Marine, became the greatest sniper in American military history. He wore a white feather to taunt his enemies. He crawled through hell to kill a general. He outdueled the enemy's best sniper, and he sacrificed his body to save his brothers. That is the legacy of Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Norman Hathcock, and that is why even today, snipers around the world still say his name with reverence. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. We'll be back tomorrow with 3 more incredible stories of warriors whose courage changed history. Until then, remember what Carlos Hathcock said: "I like shooting and I love hunting, but I never did enjoy killing anybody. It's my job. If I don't get those bastards, then they're gonna kill a lot of these kids dressed up like Marines."